My dear sisters and brothers, as we celebrate the Feast of the Sacred Heart today with this Eucharistic adoration, we realize that Father's Day weekend is here at hand. And on this most beautiful day, I'd like to share with you just one little reflection on the fatherhood of God. If you are familiar with the world religions, with ancient traditions and faiths, you will know that God was always to be feared. God was always seen as someone strong, as all-powerful, but he was perceived as being the other, the transcendent one. And God was by no means accessible. In fact, God was to be feared. And that is why religion after religion would be busy trying to appease God, pacify God with all sorts of offerings and sacrifices, even blood offerings. And so it is against this backdrop of a fear for God, because he is totally the other, the inaccessible, that Jesus would come as a breath of fresh air. And he would teach us by word and example to call God Abba, Father. My dear sisters and brothers, as we celebrate the Father's Day this weekend, I ask myself, and I pose this question to you too: why did Jesus teach us to call God Father and not Mother? If you've been with children, watching children, and observing children grow up, you will have by now realized that for the child, whether it is a he or a she, there is no separation from her mother, from his mother. The mother and the child are one. And that is why the child cannot just get away from the mother. It is all the time around the mother, with the mother, maybe on the mother, hanging on to her. There is no separation. There is no separate identity. The mother and the child are one in the child's mind. And that is why the child would demand that the mother be always near, that the mother feed her, she watch over her. There is no separation. Months go by. Somewhere around the 8th month, developmental psychologists would tell us, as the consciousness and the awareness of the child grows and develops, she or he opens the eyes and looks at someone else walking around the house and says, "And by the way, I see someone else in the house, and who is that?" And the mother points to her and says, "Honey, that's your dad, your dada, your appa, your abba, your father. You call him daddy or dad or dada." And so there is someone here in the house who is separate from the mother and therefore separate from the child, who chooses to be around, who decides to love. Notice this. So this person who is the other doesn't have to be there, but he chooses to be there. It is not expected of him to love the child in the child's mind, and yet he decides to love the child. And so, for the child, that is the first experience of an unconditional love from another person, from a third party. A love that was born out of a choice, a love that comes out of a decision. And in the scriptures, we have a word for it. We call it predilection or election. And something in me tells me that it is because of this that Jesus would teach us to call God Father. When every religion said, you don't need to love God, you need to fear God, because God is to be feared. He is totally the other, He is distant, He is not you. And yet, Jesus would come bursting onto the scene and introduce this image of God as a father, as an Abba Father. And so today, as we go through this Eucharist, let us thank the Lord for what He has given us, His Sacred Heart. And that heart that opens out the love of God for us. And so as we go through this adoration, let us thank the Lord for this gift that we have. Not something, but someone. God as our Father and Mother. As a mother, He gives birth to us, and we come to be. And as a father, He watches over us, and He protects us. And so, let us, as we go through this Eucharist, thank the Lord for what we have. To conclude, I was in the Tri-Valley for about 4 or 5 years. Pleasanton, Dublin, and Livermore. And during those years, I was involved in the ministry to the incarcerated in Santa Rita Jail. And I remember talking to some of those chaplains. They told me how for Mother's Day, the inmates kept asking them for cards so they could write to their mothers. And so when Father's Day came around, these chaplains went and bought loads and loads of cards. And then he would tell me with tears in his eyes, William, would you believe it when I tell you that we couldn't give away even one card because the inmates were angry with their fathers. And then he went on to tell me how a good number of them were there only because they felt abandoned by their fathers. Fathers who were drunkards, fathers who were drug addicts, fathers who walked out on their family. And they hold their father responsible for their being behind bars. Well, if your son or your grandson or daughter has been to jail, don't beat yourself up. You did what you could as a good father. And these are adults. They had their own decision to make. And yet, this is something that we cannot mess out. People are rebellious precisely because they do not experience that tenderness, that unconditional love from a father figure in their younger days. And so, as we go through this Eucharist, let's also pray for families that are hurting because they miss their fathers or because they didn't get to be raised by their fathers. And let us pray that all of us may appreciate what we have, a God who is our Father and Mother.